Hi, Amy.
Hey, Spencer, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Living the dream.
Board Member Levy,
Yes.
real quick before you get started.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention to you, I don't know if you saw the Seventh Circuit case in the last 2 weeks related to student dress code, but there are a couple of modifications we might want to consider to student dress code policy from that case.
Okay.
So I don't know how you want to do that, but if you want me to take a look at those policies and then you can get them on the agenda, or however you want to proceed with that, I just wanted to flag that for you.
No, thank you so much, and that would be great. Before Dr. Kieser left, we had discussed, because it's something that we want to make sure that we have student input around,
Okay.
and we talked about doing a policy workshop with students to kind of familiarize them with the process and also get their input on the specific set of policies.
Yeah.
So let's communicate offline, but thank you for definitely bringing that up.
Sounds good. Yep.
All right. Good evening, everyone. It is 5:30, and I will call this policy meeting to order. Secretary Shope, may we please have a roll call?
Yes. Spencer Anderson,
Present.
Amy Levy,
Here.
Greg Schneider.
Present.
All members are present, with Amy Levy appearing virtually.
Thank you so much. Is there a motion to approve this evening's agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a second to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, the motion passes unanimously. Next up, we have the approval of the minutes from June 1st. The only thing that I saw in the minutes before I opened the floor for a motion is, Secretary Shope, could you look at the second page, the section that begins Action Discussion G? It currently says that policy 850, 850 Rule 1, and 852 are being tabled. Could we adjust that to read postponed?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? And if you have any edits, we can handle that in discussion.
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion to approve our policy committee minutes from the June 1st meeting. There's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All right, hearing none, all in favor of approving the minutes as amended, please say aye.
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 All right, perfect. That motion passes unanimously. So that brings us to two policies for first reading, and I'd like to handle this in 5 different groupings, and if we're doing approvals, we'll do that after each section. So first we'll do 144, and then 150, and then we'll review 151 through 151.5, and then we'll end with 152 and then 153 and the Rule 1 of that policy. Does that work for everyone?
Yes.
All right, I'm seeing some heads nod. Thank you. All right, Board Member Schneider, I will begin with you. Any edits, questions, concerns with policy 144?
No.
Okay. Board Member Spencer, same question.
I do not.
All right, and I believe I saw our board president walk in. Board President Levy, any edits, questions, concerns with policy 144?
He's
No.
Okay, thank you. So a couple concerns that I have. So in that first section, actually there's just one sentence in that part. So, okay, at the end of the sentence it says let me just read the whole thing so it makes sense. In order to pursue its educational mission and also to protect the public's financial investment, the schools, the Board of Education will from time to time engage in services of qualified professional consultants to provide new insights and ideas for dealing with especially difficult problems and to provide special services which present staff are unable to provide. So a couple things that brought up for me. I want to normalize working with consultants when it makes sense, but not necessarily only when we're dealing with especially difficult problems. For example, we brought in Evergreen to help us with our compensation restructuring. I don't think that's necessarily an especially difficult problem, but that's their bailiwick and we wanted their expertise. The second issue that I'm having is to provide special services which present staff are unable to provide. That just seems like it leads with a deficiency, and it may be a case where our current staff are able to provide assistance with that, but they have so much on their plate, we need to bring in an outside consultant. So I would welcome feedback on either of those two concerns.
I agree with your concerns. The first one, I think, could be done by changing the word "and" after "with especially difficult problems" to change that to "and/or."
Thank you. Attorney Baran, am I overreading this? Is there some legal sentiment to why we have especially difficult problems listed in the policy? No.
I'm aware of, sorry. That was on mute.
Okay. And it's possible that I'm overthinking this, so please feel free to provide that pushback. And then that second concern, Board Member Schneider, do you have any feedback on special services which present staff are unable to provide? And I guess as I'm reading that again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a deficiency of skill or expertise. It could be you don't have the capacity of time to provide it. So as I'm talking through it, I think I'm okay with the second one. If everyone else is okay with especially difficult problems, I just don't want us to get in a situation where there's question on whether or not it's an especially difficult problem and should we bring in a consultant. Again, if everyone else is comfortable, it's... For President Levy, do you have any thoughts on that phrasing?
Well, overall, I think that because we're the board, we would define what the problem is if we decided to use a consultant, is the way that I would interpret the policy.
Okay. And then my only other concern on that policy is under the number 3, the superintendent of schools or designee should establish an efficient working relationship between the consultant and the board and or staff members. I would prefer to change should to will.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why that would not happen. And then the only additional circumstance I would like to bring, like that makes sense if we're bringing in a consultant that's working with the board, the administration, and the staff. I definitely think it's appropriate for the superintendent should be the liaison between the board, administration, and staff. But what about instances where we're bringing in a consultant strictly to work with the board? In that instance, I don't think it would be particularly necessary for the superintendent to kind of manage that relationship between the board and the consultant if staff are not involved. What is the feedback on that?
I agree with you. But I'm not sure that we would necessarily have to change policy for that. Since the board is working directly with the consultant, I mean, it would make sense that the superintendent wouldn't be in the middle of that to coordinate that work, other than he might be the contact person to help schedule meetings and working times.
Okay.
I think we can leave it as is without adding a board-hired consultant to that.
Okay. So is everyone comfortable with changing should to will?
Yes.
All right. Any other edits or questions for policy 144? All right, hearing none. Is there a motion to move policy 144 onto the full board for first reading?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there is a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously. So that's going to take us to policy 150. Board Member Schneider, any questions or edits for policy 150?
Not at this time.
Board Member Anderson, same question.
I don't have any at this time either.
Okay. I'll just go through mine. So number 2, so this is talking for those of you watching at home that may not have it in front of you. Policy 150 is board powers and duties. Number 2 on the list is, well, let me read the first sentence and it'll make the numbers make sense. So to achieve this goal, the board believes that it can make contributions at several levels. So number 2 is by encouraging the superintendent and other staff members to seek professional self-development in appropriate ways. So for me, that makes sense for us to encourage the superintendent to do it, but since the superintendent manages the rest of the staff of the district, it doesn't make sense for me for the board to encourage staff members to seek PD. Other feedback on number 2?
I agree with other staff members. Maybe we need to be more specific and say by encouraging the superintendent and other administrators to seek professional self-development in appropriate ways.
And I would push back slightly, and Board President Levy, I see your question mark. I'll get to you in just a second. Because the only employee of the board is the superintendent, I just don't want to overstep of course, we, support staff receiving professional development. I just don't think it's the board's place to reach out to staff to encourage that. That should happen from the superintendent administrative team or from building leaders. Board President Levy, go ahead.
I was going to add one in number 2, what that staff development is. I mean, it could be a number of different things. If you even take where we're at right now, some staff members might decide to go get a superintendent license so that they might provide service to the district at a time. Or when we look at, like, in the proposed compensation plan, there are certain licensures that are given a value because of organizational need. I think that by an action like that is the board encouraging people to get professional development. What I would also offer is that when we read the policies, those policy statements are the powers that we have, and I would not seek to narrow our power as it already has been defined in policy. Like, it's broad, I wouldn't unnecessarily narrow it.
No, and generally I agree with that, but this is very specific. How comfortable are we with restating it by saying by encouraging the superintendent and providing provisions for other staff members to seek professional self-development and appropriate, and I would just drop in appropriate ways. I think that's included, but that makes it more clear that our encouragement is by, like you said, with the compensation structure, with laying out the benefits of doing these things, but the board's not contacting staff members and encouraging them to attend conferences or et cetera. However, it would be appropriate if we saw something that may be a good fit for our superintendent to reach out and say, hey, is this something you're interested in? Have you seen this? Board President Levy, go ahead.
And that's just kind of a space where I say by encouraging, I don't know of any board member who's reached out to a teacher and said, you need to go to this. By policy, I guess, a board member could encourage them and we're not violating policy, but I don't think that that's the practice.
Thank you. Feedback from other board members?
I do like the way that you reworded number 2.
Okay, so are we comfortable with by encouraging the superintendent and providing provisions for other staff members to seek professional self-development, and just in that sentence there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Ms. Shope, were you able to capture that?
Yes, I was.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Number 5, I just wanted to get feedback on clarification. So 5 was by visiting and observing the schools of the school district and exercising general supervision over the schools without individuals directing building operations. And Attorney Barand, maybe this is something you can help with. What does providing general supervision but without directing building operations? Like, can you give us context for that verbiage?
I'm not sure where that specific verbiage came from. The statutory language does direct the board to visit and observe the schools generally. I suspect that language was intended to put some caution around board members exercising more specific authority in specific buildings where there are administrators otherwise in place, but I don't have the history on that language.
Right, and I can't imagine a current board member going into a building and overstepping. But are you able to provide any, like, legally, what does general supervision, what does that entail?
I think probably consistent with a lot of the other responsibilities that are enumerated in the policy, that there's a district-wide general supervision that also comes down to the school level. I don't have a specific legal definition of what general supervision would be other than to take it in context.
Okay. Board members, is there any hesitation on number 5, the way it is currently stated? Are we comfortable with leaving it as it currently exists?
I'm comfortable with leaving it as it exists.
I am too.
Board Member Levy, I would just note that in the statute, it does say that the full statement is that the board will exercise general supervision by visiting and examining the schools of the district, advising school teachers and administrative staff regarding the instruction, government, and progress of the pupils, and exercising general supervision over such schools. So to the extent that gives you any more, that's what the statute gives you.
So hearing that sounds like directing business operations. If I heard you correctly, could you read the part about teachers and just go maybe like that sentence?
Oh, no.
Advise, yeah, it's all phrases of one sentence, but advise the school teachers and administrative staff regarding the instruction, government, and progress of the pupils, and exercise general supervision over such schools. I think that ties into the curriculum that the board is responsible for and the general oversight of the staff.
Okay. So last call, anyone feel strongly about editing number 5, or are we comfortable with leaving it as it? Go ahead, Board President Levy.
I'm comfortable leaving our policy as it is, but I mean, I think that as the statute is, was read, you kind of see how expansive it is. But I think that based on our norms of our district, that people would feel that in that advising part or directing, I mean, there are things that we pass at the board level, and we approved a science curriculum. We're walking, you might be on the Teaching, Learning, and Equity and Pupil Services Committee, and your purpose of visiting classrooms on this day is to see the science curriculum be implemented. Not that you're going to give teachers feedback on lessons. So I think that as it's written, when I read number 5, it is, do your job of visiting schools and performing that general supervision, but you're not the school principal. You're not a administrator in the building on a daily basis is the way that I would take it.
No, and I absolutely agree. It just doesn't sound like that's what the statute says. It sounds like the statute gives board members much more broad authority. I can't imagine any of us currently on the board using that authority to offer teachers commentaries on what they're teaching, et cetera. Board President Levy, go ahead.
Right. I think that the statute is a little bit broader. Our policy is a little bit more narrow. And I think our cultural and contextual understanding as a district is that you're a board member, you're not the principal. So that's kind of a space where I don't think our practice is different than what we intend by what's written in our policy, even though it seems that the statute is a little bit wider. And I think that for us, as we have been operating, if that were to become a concern, it would bubble up to our administration side, to our superintendent or our designee, and then as a board, we would end up talking about that and coming to, like, if you look at our collective commitments, this is something that's also covered in our collective commitments, which would say, like, our collective commitment is to follow our policy and go visit our schools. So, I mean, that's just where I would take that in that conversation.
No, and here's the final thing I'll throw out on 5. I'm fine with leaving it as is. Attorney Barand, it seems like our policy is not aligned with the statute. So if it was challenged, we wouldn't fall to our policy, we would fall to the state statute. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind. 6, by performing the custodial function of watching the public purse, maintaining the educational plant, and keeping an eye on the stability of the school system. I don't know if that's a typo, but I'm not sure what maintaining the educational plant is. Board President Levy.
I would interpret that as being the physical property of the district, the facilities, the educational plant. But, I mean, if you wanted to clear up the language so people understand exactly what that is, that would be something.
Okay, so is everyone comfortable with changing that to be more clear with maintaining the physical properties? So by performing the custodial function of watching the public purse, maintaining the physical properties, and keeping an eye on the stability of the school system. Board President Levy.
But, and here's another space with, physical properties, but also like our cyber capabilities, maintaining that, like we've got firewalls and the different protections against ransomware. There's some other things that we do. I mean, it's just like keeping all of our stuff that the district is responsible for.
No, excellent point. So if we could change that to maintaining the physical and virtual properties and keeping an eye on the stability of the school system, I think that would be more appropriate. Any committee members have any additional feedback on 6? Board President Levy.
One of the things I'm thinking about, just like as, when we read it, educational plant kind of seems different. sometimes even with our own words, as we're adding to the policies, we could also be adding, like in the context, the four of us that are in the meeting tonight are a part of the discussion, and we have an understanding, and then it'll go to the full board. But at some other point in time in the future, board members may look back and say, well, what do they mean by the virtual stuff? So there's that opportunity there for that understanding. Attorney Baran, what I would ask is, like, like there's sometimes like Neola policy services. What is the boilerplate language that's used in these situations in other aspects to shape the policy as it's written?
I can take a look at that as far as defining what the property of the district is, you mean, whether that's virtual or physical? Is that essentially the question?
Right, yeah. Because, I interpret that plant part to mean, like, take care of our stuff. Like, how would we write our stuff so that it's comprehensive and we're not leaving anything out?
Okay. Let me think about that for a minute, and I will get back to you, and maybe by email after the meeting.
Okay, so we will postpone policy 150. But before we do that, that final clause at the end, the last sentence, the board shall support those educational philosophies and procedures needed to promote a superior education for Beloit students based upon the needs of the student population. Is there so superior education, I'm not sure what we're comparing it to. I would be more comfortable with quality education, but I definitely want to hear feedback first from committee members, and then board president Levy, I'll come to you.
I personally like the word superior education.
Okay. Board member Anderson?
I'm also okay with superior.
Okay. Board President Levy?
So from my school law at Ohio State, and when you look in like state constitutions, different states have different constitutions that lay out the type of education that they will deliver. Some states have clauses in their constitution where they are promising a higher grade of an education than other states are. When I read this policy, and our policy says that the school district of Beloit will promote a superior education, as I read the word superior, I read that to be the highest level that is available. It's superior versus just quality. So what that would mean is, as we translate to act in our policies, that why do we need to go to referendum? Why do we need to adopt this curriculum? Why are we doing certain things? Because the guarantee that is in our policy to the parents and the children of Beloit is not to provide them just a quality education or an adequate education, it's to provide them a superior education. And so I think that is, those words are how I would interpret that adjective, because it could have just said basic education.
Okay, thank you so much. So Attorney Brand, you will get back to us. I'm just making a note on number 6, and we will postpone this until our August 3rd meeting. So that brings us to our next grouping of policy. We're shifting to policy 151. Board Member Schneider, any questions or edits?
No, I do not have any.
Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not have any either.
Okay. My only concern is the beginning of the second paragraph. The superintendent of schools shall report to the board from time to time on policy in operation. This does not currently happen. And so we could do one or two things. We could remove it from policy, or we could ensure that this starts happening. And so we would kind of need to understand where that would be placed, or at the very least, make sure that our new superintendent is aware of this expectation, and then allow that individual to make sure that they're fulfilling the item listed in policy. Any feedback on that?
I would leave it in the policy and make sure that it is done in the future rather than to remove it. If we wanted to be more specifically, instead of from time to time, we could put, we'll report to the board quarterly on the policies and operations, just so that there's a definite time frame for it. But other than that, I would leave it as is.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to removing it either. I just wanted to give that option. I see your question mark. I'll just get to you in just a minute, Board President. And what has been our practice and policy, unless there are specific statutory obligations of when reports need to be given, we keep it broad. I think with finances, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I think it may be the requirement is twice a year, but we do that monthly. So we do a nice job in most cases of exceeding what the requirements are. So I'm not as uncomfortable as the from time to time. I'm not as uncomfortable with that, but it's just something that we need to make note of, because part of the reason for going through policy is to pick up on the things that by policy we should be doing that we're currently not. And then move to make sure those things are happening. Board President Levy?
It was just a statement that, like, as things are written like that from time to time, I think that we as a board, if there were, like you said, there's monthly policy meetings, or if there's a need for certain things to come back, that's what time to time permits. And I think it's just a matter of us taking that direction to decide that there's certain things that we want done, and then communicating with the superintendent, it would happen.
No, I hear you on that. And the language here says report to the board. So that would happen outside of policy committee. It would be a report that the superintendent provides to the board. And that doesn't necessarily have to happen at a regular meeting. That could happen through a board update. But it would be coming from the superintendent. And then it says on the policies in operation, all of our active policies are in operation. So we would just be mindful of what is most productive, the most productive way for the board to consume a reporting like that from the superintendent. Attorney Baran, and then Board Member Anderson, please.
Just real briefly, I don't know if there's an opportunity for input here from administration as to what the actual flow of information is, and if this is, intended to be a regular reporting, or if this is intended to be as things change operationally that are reflected in policy, that those things need to be brought forward.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm hearing a practical distinction there. I just want to open. I don't know if that's a place for administration to speak into.
No, absolutely. I think that's a perfect opening. Addressing policy changes, that's going to be brought up in policy that we'll discuss tonight. So there is an area to capture those changes and how the superintendent alerts the board.
Right.
But yeah, I can't see everyone that's on the, Ms. Moratek, would you like to provide any commentary?
Thank you. I was going to add just what you said with that other policy. There are days or times when we are working, and then what's relevant to what's happening in context. So there are policies that we come across that need to be updated based on what's happening in our schools. So having that opportunity to come forward, it is a great way to work hand in hand with the committee. So I think, to your point, Levy, that comes further down in a different policy.
Thank you so much. Board Member Anderson?
I'm okay with leaving it as the time to time, just because I don't want to restrict or make it so that we have to put a time frame on something, because maybe there isn't a dramatic change that we need to be aware of. And if we get busy, because I mean, as we saw before, our meetings can occasionally get quite long. And if we're like, well, we restricted ourselves to we have to report on policy operations, then now we're just adding to that workload for us and our admin also. So,
No, good point.
oh, you're fine.
Good point. And I definitely want our work to be purposeful. And I'm not married to the idea, but I'm throwing it out. What if we added to the policy committee and or board? Because right now it would have to come to the full board. Those updates from time to time, it may be relevant to provide that to the policy committee because it makes sense for us to have information as we're editing and reviewing policy, and then ultimately all of the policy information and decisions always goes before the full board, or we could leave it as is.
I would add that I agree with that because in the way of working that we've established, we do the work in the committees. So to be able to come to the committee and do that work in the committee and then bring it to the board makes sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Any other feedback before we close out policy 151? So Secretary Shope, if you can make that adjustment, the superintendent of schools shall report to the policy committee and or board, because that leaves in that flexibility, but it doesn't put us at risk of violating policy if it only happens with the committee. Again, knowing that all policy goes before the full board for final approval. All right, so we will review the 151s as a group. So we're going to move forward to 151.1, and we addressed this at our last meeting. I think to be consistent that we should adjust that header to policy 151 rule 1. Are there any issues or concerns with that nomenclature adjustment or consistency? And before we start, Ms. Shope, if we could lean on your expertise, I believe that retired is another classification of policy, unless I'm mixing up my names. So I know we have active policy, we have revisions. Our policy ever, and I know we're going through transition now, and we discussed this at our last meeting, but policy are never really deleted. Policy are retired. Is that accurate?
Correct. Excuse me, correct.
Okay.
That is board docs terminology for quote unquote deleted policies. They're not officially deleted off the system. We just retire them into the retired section. So they're no longer official policies. They're just historical perspective for administration or the board.
Okay. Is there any other category that I'm missing? So we have revised. We have all of our active policies. We have revised policies, which are also active. Instead of deleted, we have retired. Are there any other classifications of policies within board docs?
No, we do. There are areas within an active policy, such as when it was last reviewed and when it was last revised, but that is all within an active policy.
Perfect. So would it make sense to, we'll adjust the code to 151 Rule 1. Should we then adjust the title to policy adoption, revision, and retirement, since we don't delete policies? We always have them as a point of reference.
That makes sense.
Okay. So if we could make that adjustment, and with that, I open the floor. Are there any committee members or our board president that have any questions or edits for policy, which will eventually become 151 Rule 1?
Right. Just as we've changed the title in the second line of the first paragraph to take out the word deletion and put in retirement of policy.
Perfect. So yeah, Ms. Shope, if you could just make sure that the title is consistent throughout the policy, that would be helpful. Anyone else before I share my questions?
Based on our, like, the discussion we had on on 151, where we said the committee or the Board of Education, so in that first line, it says the board policies shall be systematically reviewed by the Board of Education. Well, we're reviewing them in committee first. Oh, I guess that's true. But,
Yeah,
oh, good.
no, I hear your point, but they are ultimately reviewed by the full board, even though we do a lot of the work in committee. So I think we're okay with that.
Okay.
The second paragraph, the formal adoption of policies shall be recorded in the minutes of the board, noted in the master policy logbook. Secretary Shope, is that current verbiage for what we're using, a master policy logbook?
We do still have a binder, which is called the Master Policy Logbook, where we do have a listing of the policies and when they have last been reviewed or revised or, reviewed or revised or added as if they're a new policy.
Okay, is all of the information in the master policy logbook, and I hope the answer is yes, also available in the policy manual in board docs?
I would have to double check that, but it is electronic as well.
Okay. Are we comfortable with noting the policy manual in board docs? I feel a little uneasy with referencing a static binder. What is the feedback from other committee members or board president Levy? Yep, go ahead, board president.
Right, so that's kind of an anachronism for time. Like, where is the physical binder with our policies? However, I think that I would say, like, the spirit of that is, like, you know, people need to be able to get a hold of the policies. And so, like, as, you know, every month, these policies are in flux and changing as they go through the committee, and then the board is taking action on them. It's maintained in board docs, but I mean, I think that what we say is that people always have the ability to print them out.
So are you in favor of, instead of listing master policy logbook, the policy manual in board docs, or am I misunderstanding your statement?
Well, I'm kind of walking my way through what is written and then what our practice may be, and how, like, when this is adopted in 1980, last revised in 2019, and you can see the prior revision dates there. So now it's 2022, and we're like, yeah, who really has the binder with everything in it? Like, was it updated to reflect last month and what got approved? I mean, there's that part of it. So it's like, but it's most important that people be able to understand what the policies of the district are and where can I find them. So that's kind of where I'm at.
So it
Not a
sounds
clear
like
answer,
you're
just to
in
kind of like, oh, that's something to think about.
I am in favor for omitting the master policy logbook, not burning it or anything, but for purpose of policy. I am most comfortable with directing people to the policy manual housed in board docs, which has everything in one place, and people don't have to come to a location to get it. You just need access to the internet, and you can view and print anything you need.
I'm okay.
All right.
Okay, yeah, I'm okay with removing master
good.
policy logbook.
Okay, perfect. And then continuing on, my one other item that I wanted to address, and posted on the district website in board docs. So the district doesn't have a website in board docs. I think it maybe should have read the district website and in board docs, but I don't think our policy is on the website, except by the pressing the link that's in board docs. So that was a really long way of saying I think we should remove district website because it's in board docs. And that doesn't mean that the website can't direct people to board docs, but our policy aren't, unless there's something I'm missing, our policy are not housed on our website. Board President Levy, if you were talking, you're muted.
I'm okay with removing the website and just saying posted in board docs.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Sounds like we are ready to move. Oh, and the other thing that I just want, Board Secretary Shope, the general, so in the library, there's a general library item for the board policy key. If you could just make sure that that is congruent with our edits to policy, with our, let me scroll back up, revised and retired instead of revised and deleted, just to make sure that we're consistent everywhere that we're talking about policy. That brings us to what is currently 151.2. I recommend that we change that to be consistent with our nomenclature to policy 151 Rule 2. Committee members, any questions or edits?
No, I have none.
Okay, so I'll jump in. I'll read that first sentence. The superintendent of schools shall establish and maintain an orderly plan for the notification, distribution, publication, and preservation of all policies adopted by the Board of Education and the administrative rules and regulations needed to put them in effect. So for those of you who attend policy frequently, Dr. Kieser would very regularly reference when we would go through rules of policies. I'll make sure that's in administrative regs, et cetera. So in the spirit of full transparency, I reached out to Mrs. Mortek and asked her, and we'll get to the why in just a little bit, where are administrative regulations housed? And the feedback is that those were the rules of policies. Well, I was exploring board docs, which I encourage everyone to do. And if you go to board docs under policy, you have a couple options. So under policy, you can either select policy manual. It's going to list all the policies. Everyone can see that. Or if you use that little caret and do the drop down, administrative regulations should be housed there. Now, my concern is if you do that, there is one administrative reg that is housed there, but that kind of conflicts with what Dr. Kieser would say, oh, I'll make sure that's added to administrative regs. So Secretary Shope, is there something that we're missing? Is there another home that you are aware of where administrative regulations are housed?
No, that is the place where the administrative regulations are supposed to be. And so as the committee was starting to go through policies and determine whether it should be in board policy or whether it should be in administrative regs or whether it should be in the employee handbook, that was happening a lot in the 500 series. I was here for the start of that, and then I was out for a large portion of that, for most of the rest of that. And so I had asked for a list of which ones ended up being administrative regs and needed to come out of board policy, because some of them, it sounded like we're staying in board policy as well. And so—
May I interject?
Yeah.
Okay, so for consistency and completeness, the decision was made to keep everything in policy, but to pull out those rules of how the administration implements the policy, and those items would be in administrative regulation. So it wouldn't be a deletion from policy, but a pulling from policy the procedures and guidelines, and those would be in administrative regulations. For example, the one item that is in administration regs is AR 523.6. That is policy 523.6, but the AR designation that I would assume, and Ms. Mortek, feel free to jump in if you have a different understanding, is that tells staff that this is the thing that's going to help you implement policy 523.6. Does that make sense?
Sorry about that, walking up to the microphone. Yeah, that does make sense to me. I think that we just need to follow up and get that done. In addition, we talked about the superintendent schools shall establish and maintain an orderly plan for notification. I did ask about that as well. And just in all transparency, that's been done a couple different ways. So in addition to keeping current with the regs, we also talked about Ms. Shope, or board secretary, putting out an all-staff email to notify updates that have been made in board during committee and then moved forward after the board meeting, just to keep people abreast to changes, because there are a number of policies, and sometimes you may not know as a staff member in schools about those policies, and you're working your day-to-day and you may not be within unison of the most current policy. So we established that rule of thumb that we will move forward on, and then of course when we get our official superintendent in place, then that'll be up to he, she, or they about how they want to move forward on that.
Perfect. So Board President Levy, I would love your input on this, because I think this is a situation where we have found in policy a project. And I don't think it's up to the policy committee to best outline how this project should be attacked. But what needs to happen is our rules of policies, our procedures and guidelines for how to implement the policy. So the rules need to be duplicated in the administrative regs. And the way that's done is it's given the designation of AR. So that needs to be populated. So what is the best way to kind of formally alert, for lack of a better term, hey, we found in policy something that needs to happen that has not currently happened. This is a project that needs to be worked on, and we kind of do that handoff. And then I would imagine, and feel free to push back, that the board president would work with the administration to figure out the best way to execute that need that we found identified in policy. Your feedback, please.
So when you look at our board doc setup, we have to the far left-hand corner, it says book, and you can see our policies, series 100 to series 900.
Yep.
And if you click that, then you can click the one that says administrative guidelines, and you see one that AR 500 at 523.6. That's the only thing that exists there. In other districts, some of which use services like Neola policy services, and their policies are housed within board docs. Neola has generated the policies, and those boards have gone through their process to approve them. But then accompanying those policies, because there's different companies that do policy services for districts, but accompanying those policies are administrative guidelines that are created for the administrators in the district to use to carry out the policies. So this is what the policy says, but in the practical matter of an administrator working on a day-to-day basis, how do I carry out that policy? That's written in administrative guidelines. What we're describing now and what I would see is that we have all of our policies, series 100 to series 900, and if guidelines need to be created, or what we're calling administrative regulations need to be created to carry them through, that seems like an untenable project. And there's a better way to achieve that. You know, we kind of go back to some of the policies we talked about before. That might mean going to a consultant. But there's things that, there's just a difference for how some of our work has been done in the past and what way would we want to address it. Because absence of administrative guidelines, let's say you're hiring brand new principals, brand new APs, people that were teachers and now they're becoming administrators. Like, unless they're working with someone who says this is the way we do it in Beloit, they kind of wouldn't know what to do. But if you're any of those categories of people and you have the policy that's on board docs, and then you can, you know, click the tab and see an administrative guideline, then you have a procedure to follow to carry out that policy. So that's a tool, excuse me, I'm sorry. So that would be like, as we discuss it, like you said, what help would the board president provide? Like, that's another part of giving our people the tools that they need to do their jobs and the things that we've asked them to do.
So it's not that the guidelines or the regulations don't exist. They're embedded in policy in the form of rules. I just think it would be convenient, since we have an administrative regulation section, that we populate that with the rules, which are those procedures and guidelines for properly executing policy, and populate that in the space where they're supposed to be. So I can just send you a quick email offline, because this may be something that governance would like to pick up. Board President Levy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as you say about, you know, possibly sending that to governance, and so like combing our policies, series 100 to 900, to find every place that there's a rule, I don't think, and then having that translate into a guideline, like.
It is the guideline.
Right. So if every policy we have does not have a corresponding guideline, then they don't all have guidelines. So it is something that I could see taking it up in governance and working with our district administrator to remedy what we are thinking might be an issue. And like I said, it's kind of as board members, we want to create policy that helps the administrators in the day-to-day operation to ensure the program of schooling for our students. Those guidelines are important and helpful because it helps our administrators know what to do. But absence, like I said, there are some rules there, and then for some, there's probably not. But that is the consistency of creating a policy environment in our district where people are able to document something and see where it's at, to know what they're doing, and not, well, we've been doing this since Dr. Smith was here. You know, it's just, but not being able to point to it. So as we're having a discussion in the policy committee and we're bringing up various things, those are the concerns that I would think about in governance and seek to correct, so that we're providing the people that work for us the best tools available.
Perfect. If we move down in that same policy, so again, we're on 151, which will be referred to as Rule 2, not Point 2. It says all newly adopted and amended policy will be distributed to all district staff. Attorney Baran, by updating it in board docs, could that meet the obligation for distributed? And what I mean by that is all district staff have access to the most currently approved policy.
I don't have a problem with that legally. If the board of administration wants to do it practically differently to provide notice, I think that's also fine.
Yeah, and more is always better, but I just want to make sure that we are in line with what our policy states. So I just wanted to confirm that that would meet that that obligation of the word distributed to make it widely available. And then the final section says all policy manuals distributed to anyone remain the property of the school district of Beloit and shall be considered as on loan. And then it goes on. I am wondering if we still need to have that. Does anyone do that anymore? Has anyone printed out a policy manual and is passing it out? This just basically says that it's not theirs, it's ours, it's on loan, whoever's hands it lands in, and we can ask for it back at any time. Is that still relevant, is my question.
We no longer print out policies and have them in binders for anybody. We used to. We had over 100 binders, I think, at one time that were out and about, and we would send updates like to our legal counsel as well as all the administrators in the district and everything, so there would be no purpose for it anymore.
Okay. I would recommend that we omit those last two sentences since that's not a practice that we have and all current policy is housed on board docs. Are there any objections to omitting those last two sentences? Okay.
No.
All right, so we will move on to policy 151.3, which will become policy 151, rule 3, policy suspension. Board members, are there any questions or edits? Okay, I don't have any either. I think it's fine as is. That brings us to policy 151.4, which will be 151 rule 4, administration and policy absence. Board members, any questions or edits? Okay, I just have two. The second line, if we could include the superintendent or designee. So again, we can be consistent with the rest of our policy. And then that last two sentences read, decisions made by the superintendent, however, shall be subject to review by action of the board and it's at its regular meeting. I would like to adjust that to include regular or special meeting. For example, if something happened today, we would have to wait 13 more days before we meet again. And I would just like for us to have the flexibility. If a decision was made in the absence of policy by the superintendent, and for some reason the board found that egregious and needed to take action, I wouldn't want to limit us to have to wait until the next regular meeting. So again, if we could have that to read at its regular or a special meeting. Are there any objections to that? Okay. All right, next up, policy 151. Oh, were you trying to say something, Board President Levy? Yeah, go ahead.
I was possibly thinking, like you said, or is it to the same effect, but as you said, the next regular meeting or special meeting or our next noticed public meeting? Because you just don't have to write whether it's going to be regular or special, but if something were to happen today on the 6th, it would take 24 hours to give the proper notice and then the next day. So just thinking at the next noticed meeting.
So I think all of our meetings, whether regular or special, the understanding is that they'll be properly noticed. So I'm comfortable with just having regular or special. Is there any different feedback from other members? Okay. All right, so that brings us to policy 151.5, which will be 151 Rule 5. Board members, any questions or edits to this policy? All right, I would just like to highlight on that first sentence, the superintendent of schools shall prepare and disseminate administrative rules. So that kind of goes back and fills in some of the information that we were just discussing, that is a responsibility of the superintendent. And then logistically how that happens, of course, I think we would leave up to that person. Yeah, go ahead, Board President Levy.
I'm trying to toggle between our screens. I'm sorry. I think that in looking at that, I need to see it. This is 150. This is absence.
1.5, which will be Rule 5, that first sentence.
I'm sorry. Is this G or H? Where are we at?
This is H. Yeah.
All right. So as I read H, the superintendent of schools shall prepare and disseminate administrative rules necessary to implement specific Board of Education policies. That we just had that conversation about where those rules are that end up going into regs. The superintendent shall review or cause to be reviewed such rules to determine their effectiveness in carrying out policy. The board shall review and approve any or all administrative rules and may suggest or direct that certain rules be added, modified, or deleted. I think that this is a part of like that oversight that we as a board perform. The superintendent is creating rules or practice or administrative guidelines, but let's see, like as we have conducted expulsion hearings and a number of other functions, and there have been discussions about why was this done or that done, that's a part that we are not currently experiencing in our roles to be able to give feedback in a formal manner and to see something added, modified, or deleted, or reviewed in that manner to determine its effectiveness. I think that through our experience of serving, we have found that we're in this space where how we actually carry this out, the process of doing this has not happened.
Correct. And so that's why we need for our next superintendent to follow this policy and to not just say, I'll put that administrative regs, but to actually do it so that we can do our part, which is to review and approve those regs and then propose or direct edits as well. So absolutely, just want to make sure that, yeah, go ahead.
And because like you said, that's that space of people properly understanding how we are fulfilling our roles and responsibility in the district, and that no one is micromanaging or overreaching, that we are just following the policies, and it's a natural process because we're doing what we've written that we're going to do, and everyone understands that.
Absolutely. But in so many instances, in order for us to provide our oversight, that formal documentation has to exist so we have something to review. So those were just the two concerns that I wanted to, not even concerns, the two items that I wanted to highlight in that policy. I don't think that anything needs to be added. We just need to adhere to the policy. And by we, I mean us as the board and our next superintendent. So we have reviewed policy 151 and policy 151.1 through 0.5, which will change to rule 1 through rule 5. Is there a motion to approve as amended policy 151 and then 151, which will be rule 1 through 151.5 or 151 rule 5, to the full board for first reading? And again, that's as amended.
So moved.
Second?
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously. That brings us to policy
Point of clarification, please.
Please.
Did I hear you say that in policy 151.5 becoming Rule 5, that in the last sentence you wanted deleted changed to retired? I thought I heard you say that.
Okay, we're specifically looking at policy 151.5, which is going to be Rule 5.
Yes, and in the last sentence of the policy, where it says rules to
Yes.
be added, modified, or deleted, did you say change that to retired?
I didn't say specifically for this one, but when we first brought it, if we can just make sure that all of the policy are consistent with that language,
Okay.
that would be perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought I heard you say it, but I wasn't sure, so thank you.
No, thank you. All right. So that brings us to policy 152. Board members, any questions or edits? All right, I will jump in. I'm starting at that second paragraph, and I want to read the second paragraph and the first sentence of the last paragraph. Board and administration objectives will be identified for each district-wide goal established. action plans shall be developed to ensure achievement of the goals. Goals will be monitored and adjusted if necessary throughout the year. So one, I just want to highlight this because this is what our policy reads, and I think it's very important that we're mindful of this policy as we're finishing our strategic plan to make sure that the goals and the objectives in our strategic plan are aligned with this policy. So I don't necessarily need are suggesting any changes, but I want to make sure that we're mindful to make sure that we're adhering to policy. And then that first sentence of the last paragraph, a performance disclosure report shall be adopted and published annually. To my knowledge, this is not currently happening. Ms. Shope, if you have any information on when the last time this happened, that would be helpful. And if you don't have the information, don't feel bad at all. I'm just asking.
I have some information. I would say the last time that it was specifically done as like a booklet type thing would have been a few years ago. And it was called like Points of Pride. But I do believe that there have been reports made to the board since that time where either principals were coming to the board and making reports about their schools specifically. So it wasn't necessarily something published annually, but they were coming and making their reports each month. A different principal would come from their school and make a report about their goals and their strides throughout the school year or throughout the last school year. So that was being done 1 or 2 years where the actual document might not have been published. And then I don't think anything was necessarily done during the COVID year because it was,
Right.
Kind of an odd situation. So I think, there wasn't a whole lot being done during that time frame when we were teaching more virtually and not in our buildings. And then this past year, I think the focus was more on getting things back to a normal cadence and getting everybody going again and things. So I don't believe it was done this year, but I think there were several reasons for that.
No, and no judgment. But again, I want to, as policy chair, to make sure that we are adhering to policy moving forward. And so this is just something that I want to put on the radar of our new superintendent, that the policy expectation is that a performance disclosure report, and if it has a cute name like Points of Pride under it, but I want to make sure that there is an annual report that's identified as a performance disclosure report. I think we can kind of work out as a board when we want that natural cadence to be so everyone knows when to expect it. So I think it's important to get that on our calendar of events. And before I yield the floor to you, Board President Levy, I just want to read that last sentence because I think that this is critical. It outlines what's in that performance disclosure report that shall be adopted and published annually. The report shall describe the board's and school administration's educational goals and objectives, including learning-related performance objectives and test results required by law. So I think that that is an important document that we make sure that we consistently create, approve, and publish, and then that way we can benchmark our achievement and celebrate our successes. Board President Levy?
Yes, that's one of the things that if you look at our board annual evaluation that we conduct 2 times a year, that first category for us, it talks about data-driven decision-making. And so like some of the information that we are asked about in that, and consider how we have rated ourselves as a board, is kind of related to this area. There are some initiatives across the state that people are engaged in, things like Redefining Ready, where districts are producing scorecards, where you can see year-over-year performance. I know that we do have, as a parent, I've received information about my child's performance individually. But like for our parents to understand where our students are they at above or below expectations? But then also too for our community to understand there's multiple measures that come, and they're predictable by DPI's timeline, and you'll see these headlines in the newspaper on a regular schedule. Like ACT and AP will be coming up as those things are reported. And I know that some of these things are also being addressed in our strategic plan, but this is another one of those items we're working with our administration to achieve to our satisfaction that we are doing what our policy says and meeting that requirement. It's there, like I said, we have received reports in the Teaching, Learning, Equity, and Pupil Services Committee on various other measures. But like I said, being able to, here's the 2022 performance, here's the 2023 performance, and knowing, like I said, for me, it's important. So like you said, that we're able to mark, this is where we started before our strategic plan was adopted. 3 years later, these are the strides that we have made. So that's another part of us being able to communicate out to our public that the investment of taxpayer dollars, the performance of our staff and our students, this is what it has resulted in.
No, absolutely. And that was a nice segue when we talk about board evaluation. I got ahead of myself. Okay. So are there any edits or adjustments? Again, I didn't have any. There's just a couple things that I wanted to highlight, again, to make sure that we are adhering to our current policy that is so critically important. Is there a motion to move on policy 152 to the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
I'm confused. If there's no
No, go ahead.
revisions, why would we move it forward?
You are absolutely right, Ms. Sho. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So that moves us along to policy 153, which again is a nice segue when we talk about board evaluation. So one thing that I want to point out, because it appears in Rule 1, so actually I want to look at 153, sorry about that, Rule 1 for just a minute, and then we're going to bounce back to 153.
Point of order.
And actually I'll read it. You don't even have to switch it out. Ms. Sho. So number 1, it's the implementation procedure
Point of order.
Go ahead.
So we had a motion and a second on that on 152. Do we have to technically let that vote die or do something to kind of wrap that up?
Thank you, Board Member Anderson. Since there was a second, we can't pull it. So all in favor, please say aye. All opposed, please say nay. Nay.
Nay.
Nay.
Thank you so much. All right. So if we please keep policy 153 pulled up, but I'm going to jump to policy 153 Rule 1, and I have a question for Attorney Baran. Number 1 says the board adopts a policy statement on board assessment. All right, that's all I needed from that rule. Now, if we go to the policy that's presented, that first paragraph, Attorney Baran, can that count as our policy statement?
I considered that it did, yes.
Okay. Is anyone opposed to us labeling that, putting that header in of policy statement? All right. Hearing no objections. All right. I yield the floor. Are there any board members that have any questions or edits for policy 153?
I have none.
Okay. So that second, so what is going to be labeled as our policy statement is that first paragraph, and then the remaining information says at least once each year the board will assess its own performance according to standards established by the board, with advice and assistance from the superintendent. I'm not sure how much advice or assistance was needed from the superintendent for us to do our board evaluation through school perceptions. Board President Levy, you have commentary on that?
Yes, I'm gonna find this thing again. I think, so there were two thoughts. One, it is our norm as the seven of us are working. We have decided that we do it twice a year, but that's not written anywhere. So there's an opportunity to change it because right now it says at least once, or it could stay the same. With the advice and assistance from the superintendent, I would leave that because, like I said, even as leaders change and board members change, that, examining that school perceptions document when the board president and the superintendent sit down to set agendas or goals, that is where that advice and assistance may come from, or as, the board president or even board members determine how the board is operating, or are there things that we need to address? Like I said, in our experience, our first result was that we had improved relations, and now there's 4 other categories that we'll be working on to achieve. So I think that somewhere in there, but even as I'm reading the policy, this information will be used by the board each year in establishing goals and objectives, that it's even, like if you read the policy, we can be even more attentive to detail to specifically make sure we're making that requirement so that we're explicit in our work.
Right, and I think with identifying that as our policy statement, and it'll make more sense once we get to Rule 1, but I'm comfortable with leaving the language as it is because there are several places throughout policy where it may say at least once a year or at least quarterly. If we're doing that more, then we have generally taken the position of leaving it as is because we know we're meeting that requirement. All right. Any other comments or edits before we move to Rule 1 of Policy 153? All right. Any edits on that rule or questions?
It seems strange to me that we start right off the bat with a numbered sequence without a sentence above explaining what that is. I would think we would want to add something like the board will follow following the below or the steps below in the evaluation process or something of that type that just identifies what those 9 statements really mean.
So would you be comfortable with the Board of Education will follow, the Board of Education will use the following steps to implement its evaluation process?
That sounds good.
Okay. And I would actually recommend that in the title, instead of saying implementation procedures, if we put evaluation of internal board operation, implementations, and procedures. Usually the rule that tells us how to do the thing includes the information from the policy that it is a rule of. Or it could be implementation procedures for evaluation of internal board operations. That would link it to that policy 153. Are there any objections to adjusting the title to be more specific?
No.
Okay. So Ms. Shope, again, we are requesting that the title read implementation procedures for evaluation of internal board operations. And then did you need anything repeated for that opening clause before we go into our numbers?
I don't believe so. No, I think I got both.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I would actually recommend that we omit numbers 5 and 6, mainly because it just doesn't fit our current practice. What we have used, which I think worked really well, was School Perception's annual board development tool. but the policy is currently stating that the way we will implement that evaluation process is that the chair, and I'm assuming they mean policy chair, or designee, receives the completed assessment instructions and prepares the annual summative report by plotting and recording individual board member ratings. An average of each dimension may also be included. And then 6, the chair distributes the summative report to board members. It seems our practice has been to use School Perception's annual board development tool, and that doesn't, like, we could use a different tool, but I think that is more robust than me sending out a survey and asking people what they think and collecting that information and then distributing a report, and that's currently how it's outlined in the procedures. So again, I would recommend that we omit 5 and 6, but we would keep 4, which is board members independently evaluate the board as a whole. It just doesn't tie us down to how that should happen, so that would give us the liberty to do what we did and use a board development tool. Are there any objections to omitting 5 and 6?
No objection.
Okay. Yep, go ahead, Board President Levy.
Might sound ridiculous, but like when I read the designee in 5, I mean, that could be school perceptions, and that is what they have done. But like in this part 6, is just to make sure that the report is distributed to board members. I mean,
and that has happened in our process, and I think with 4 and 7, that kind of bridges the gap. So 4 is saying that, you know, board members are going to agree to provide information. And then 7, the board reviews / discusses the report and identifies. So all of the things that we did, I think, are outlined in 1 through 4 and 7 through 9. Just me generating the report and then distributing it, or whoever the policy chair happens to be. I don't think that's necessary. All right. So it sounds like we're okay with moving forward with policy 153, rule 1, omitting number 5 and number 6. All right. So with that, is there a motion to pass on policy 153 and policy 153, rule 1 as amended to the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
Second.
Right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously, which brings us to our next meeting date. Policy Committee will next meet on Wednesday, August 3rd at 5:30, and that brings us to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
There is a motion. Second, is there any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 That motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.